which meant you paid on the average under 10% of your income for rent. Sometimes well less, and it depended, of course, on how good the apartment was or the home was. This was never raised, which made problems that especially private house owners, but also public ones, could not do much to fix the facades. And they tended to crumble and so forth and make a bad impression for tourists coming in. But if you went in, the apartments were almost always nicely and well furnished, whether good taste or not depended on the person, but well furnished. But outside they didn't usually look good, except for the new buildings, which they began in the 60s, and then especially starting 71, a giant housing program, not always very fancy looking, they were straight up and down prefab buildings. They didn't look bad. I lived in one. I was perfectly satisfied with them. And for many people, it meant a move out of old-fashioned homes without proper sanitation, without proper heating, no central heating, etc. And here, but at a low rent. From 1961, when I moved into the Karl-Marx-Allee, which was then one of the main streets, until 1990, I paid 114 marks, and it never changed. Now, and since then, it's gone up and up and up and up and up and up. Well, now I pay 600 euros, which meant 1,200 West marks, which meant who knows how many East marks, depending on how you exchanged it. And even if you couldn't pay this little bit, this very low rent, you could not be evicted. Evicting people was forbidden by law, which meant that even people who didn't pay their rent for 2 years, they could only be taken out of their apartment if another apartment was found for them, a cheaper one. So that this meant that in 38 years, I saw not a single person sleeping in the street or in the park, and no beggars. These were the kind of, one other thing, education, free from nursery, kindergarten, school, college, postgrad, all of it free. And as of college, and also for high school juniors and seniors, you got a certain amount of money, which was enough to cover, for the students, enough to cover living expenses. Not too much more, it was tight, but it was to cover, which meant that in those 4 years of college, and with my 2 sons, you never heard of students working on the side, ever. You studied and you didn't work. If you wanted to work, maybe in the summer vacation, but otherwise no jobs. And you were guaranteed a job in your trade afterwards, which meant, of course, that they didn't, it was not so easy to get into college. It was limited basically to the number who would find jobs afterwards in that field. But it was no shame to become an apprentice in all kinds of different, in every possible trade, hundreds of trades, an apprentice. And if you took not a 2-year apprenticeship, but a 3-year, you also, that was good for college entrance preparation. You were guaranteed a job in your trade with one proviso. You had to commit yourself for the first 3 years after graduation to working where they put you, if needed. This was mostly true for the medicine students, who were often sent to rural areas where it was hard to find doctors, in the hopes that they settled there. But for 3 years they had to, then it was up to them. This meant, oh, and the most important of all, you couldn't be fired, so that nobody was afraid on the job of losing their job. You couldn't be fired. Time's running out, but I'll try to close it. No.
It's okay.
Which meant that there was a more, by and large, there was a more relaxed atmosphere at work. It meant that people would go to the dentist or the doctor on working time. They'd even go to the little shops, which in most factories, especially if there was something special, either something you couldn't get outside because the factories were better supplied than outside, things which were in many years difficult to get, like imported fruits, for example, or fresh strawberries, fresh cherries, fresh tomatoes. They got them first there, so that every team, when they hear, aha, the shop is having fresh tomatoes, they'd send a couple of them from the team to buy for the course, which all meant perhaps less productivity, because people were not afraid of losing their jobs. But as I say, are we on this earth to produce some new doohickey to beat the rival, or to make something which is already obsolete or breaks down after the guaranteed time? Maybe it's not so bad. Of course, there are many problems involved, and there were many problems involved in the GDR because we were under constant pressure. There were difficulties and problems with the Soviet Union, which changed. The problems when Stalin was in power until 1953 were of one kind, pretty strict and pretty tough, and sometimes could be nasty, especially to Nazis or to people who were considered to be Nazis. There were many problems in those first years. When Stalin died, shortly after it was Khrushchev, the whole atmosphere changed. There was a so-called thaw in books. That's when these wonderful Soviet films started coming out, like The Cranes Are Flying. A few of you may have seen them. There's a whole series of very wonderful films and books, and this was reflected in the GDR too. Then after Khrushchev was kicked out in '64, Brezhnev came in with a tougher thumb, and then later Gorbachev, which caused all kinds of problems in the last period, the last 3 years or 4 years. But the main pressure was from the West, because the West, which got millions in Marshall Plan money and had all the billions from these war criminals who had made it by slave labor during the war, they had this money, and they had the management, and they had the world market, which the GDR never had, which meant that we were, although everybody got along, there were always shortages. There were always things you couldn't get, or which you had to run to get. What often happened, for example, two women would meet in the street, and one would say to the other, "Oh, what a nice new coat you have. It must be from the West," which is almost assumed. No, I got it here," the other woman says. "Oh, you got it here, where?" And the woman might race to try and see it, maybe get a same one, which was usually sold out by then, because they could never keep up with demand. And people had money, since they didn't pay for all these other things. They had more money than production could keep up with. And not only that, but faced with every evening television from the West in the same language, with relatives over there telling us how terrible life was with us and how wonderful it was over there, and people often believing it. How many of you remember the film series Dallas? Some of you may remember, telling the wonderful life of these oil barons in Texas. An awful lot of naive East Germans thought, "Oh, that's how people live in the West. Wouldn't it be nice to live like that?" And this caused, since you already had lots of backward thinking, but fascist thinking, anti-Semitic thinking, anti-racist thinking was obviously always there in an undercurrent, but these people kept their mouths shut, which to me was very important. It couldn't be abolished completely, such thinking, but they talked in private with their families or their close circle, but not publicly. Publicly was an anti-fascist atmosphere in films, in books, in theater, in the names of streets and schools, which was very close to my heart, plus solidarity with the ANC in South Africa, with Allende in Chile, with the North Vietnamese, especially South Africa, as I mentioned, the opposite of West Germany, which was always on the wrong side. That also made the GDR close to me, but there were big problems. The main problem was this pressure from the West all the time. But this meant that the leadership was fearful of the GDR going down the drain. And therefore, I would say the word is repressive. It meant that the media were had to stick to the line. And unfortunately, the people who were in charge in the leadership of the party, the Politburo, had all been active anti-fascists, had fought either in Spain, the underground, had been in exile, or had been in prison, some of them in concentration camps, penitentiaries. Honecker was 10 years in Nazi prison. But this made them very anti-fascist, anti-capitalist, but also perhaps bitter and unable properly to find rapport with this population, which was to an extent very pro-socialist, but only to a certain degree. Always there was an element which was very pro-West, and a large number in the middle who were like this. And they never really mastered the technique or the in publicity, in media, of reaching these people and convincing them and winning them. Instead, it was just hard and fast, and this turned an awful lot of people against the GDR. There were exceptions. There were some very wonderful magazines and news magazines and wonderful television shows, along with the very boring ones. The theater was wonderful. In East Berlin, I think it was perhaps the best in the world, certainly the best in Europe. There was wonderful opera, which is very much appreciated in Germany. There were magnificent films, which few people saw because they were not shown in Western countries. Anti-fascist films, films against anti-Semitism. But nevertheless, this rapport with the people was never properly achieved. And in the last years, especially with the confusion connected with Gorbachev and the fact that they could not catch up with the electronics that were new in the world, and the little GDR could not compete with IBM and Sony, with the necessity to build this huge housing program, and the necessity to keep the military never to the level of the West, but not to fall too far behind. That cost billions, and the trade situation was difficult. So the GDR in the end was in pretty deep debt in terms of Western currency, but never gave up this social level which had reached till the end. However, it wasn't enough. Younger generations especially took all this thing with education and medicine, they took it for granted. It's always been like that. They didn't realize, and I used to speak to people at talks like this one, I'd tell them, you know, if things turn capitalist, you'll have all the Coca-Cola you want. You'll be able to travel all over the world, which you can't now, which was one of their main reasons for being bitter. But you may well not have a job. And I'd see in their eyes, well, so what? You get compensation, maybe even better than I get wages now. They'd have their dream of the Westmark. They'd have their dream of being able to visit the Golden Gate Bridge or the Tower of Pisa. And these elements played a very big role. And you'd be able to get a nice car, a VW, or a Fiat, or an Opel, or maybe a Mercedes or a BMW, instead of the little cars they had. All this, or you'd be able to get bananas. Sometimes 1990 was called the Banana Revolution. And today, to this day, the East Germans eat more bananas than anybody else in Europe because they were so hard to get then. And this caused this, what many people called a popular democratic revolution, but in my view, was basically counter-revolution, because all the big capitalists came back. And whereas some people have it today better, and some people have it more or less the same, some people have it much, much worse, especially groups like single parents, older people, younger people who have no definite future, and they don't know, with temporary jobs, they don't know how they'll last. Should we get married? Should we have children? The same problems faced here have caused a great deal of disillusionment, especially in East Germany, where the blossoming landscapes which were promised them, you have whole areas which are almost deserted today in the south. There are a few centers which have been built up, Leipzig, Dresden, but whole areas which are the small towns and villages, or virtually old people are there, and sometimes young men who, unlike the girls, were afraid to go out on their own to West Germany to look for jobs. hang around and are prey for the Nazis, who have come in or have come out of the woodwork where they had been hiding. And therefore there's a very strong right-wing danger today, a great danger. To conclude, I'll say, to bring you up to date, that this right-wing danger is especially strong in East Germany and threatens to take over in two states which are having elections in September, Saxony and Brandenburg, but is no longer on the national level, has reached a certain level, 11 to 13% of the vote. But in recent months, there's been a strange new development. People are so angry at the government, which is a coalition, Merkel's Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats. They see them as no good. They make promises, and therefore people vote against the establishment, which means they either turn to the right, to these fascist bunches who blame everything on the immigrants and the Muslims, or some of them believe in the dangers of environment, and they turn to the Greens, which have now amazingly become the strongest party. Or they're competing with the Christian Democrats. At the moment, it seems even that they're ahead, leading the list. Unfortunately, the Left Party was not, which was fairly strong in the East, about 15 to 25%, has been losing ground. It has, partly because of quarrels within the party, and because its lack of vigorous militant action in the streets. It's taken a good stand against war in Afghanistan and on anti-fascism, on workers' rights, but it has not been seen in the streets, and for many people it's also part of the establishment. So they voted Green, or they voted fascist, or they don't vote. And I just hope that the present situation, where people are burning hot mad in large parts of Germany about the rent, increase in rent, and the rip-off that these big companies are taking in rent, and then not building enough social housing anymore, that maybe if the left gets into that fight, perhaps it can recoup its losses, because at present it's been going down and down. I think I'll close with that, except for saying, I should also say, there's also a Communist Party in Germany, almost only in West Germany, because it was in the East Germany, it had been part of the ruling party there, which joined with some leftists in the West to form this Linke, the Left Party. But the Communist Party itself is very, very small. It's under 1% in the votes. It takes a position, it's divided. Some say we should support, at least in the elections, we should support the much bigger left party, the Linke. Others say no, we should be independent. They've quarreled, just as there are quarrels within the Linke party. Some who would like to be respectable and get into the government positions, others who say no, we should be fighting in the streets and not compromising on our basic issues. And these differences have cost an awful lot in the political scene. And as I see it in Germany as here, it's vitally important that all the different movements on very different issues, the people who are fighting on rent, or here, the Black Lives Matter, the gay movement, the Latinos, the people who fight on women's issues, all of these groups, and the same in Germany. But most centrally of all, the main fight, it seems to me, is to bring these together in a fight for peace. Because what many Americans do not see, the acute danger right now with NATO armies right on the Russian border, close to St. Petersburg, and in the Ukraine, and in Syria, and trying to encircle Russia in the south, something which could go off in any day, and then you have an atomic war, and all the worries about ecology and climate, it's all gone. And I think I see this as necessitating a cooperation between all who are in any form of opposition, including those who were within the Democratic Party. People like Bernie Sanders, whom I admire most of all, because he took away the taboo on the word socialism, which was very important, especially with young people. Even though his ideas of socialism are not exactly the same as mine, nevertheless, this word is in discussion today, and that's important. And the same is true of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the others, these Omar, these other people. They're bringing these subjects in discussion. I would say, personally, if they're in the Democratic Party fighting, I may have no illusions about the Democratic Party. I think it's still ruled by basically the same people who rule both parties. But if there are elements in there who are willing to fight, support them, but the main thing is to fight to get people in motion, moving and fighting in the streets, in the colleges, in the factories. And this is true in both countries, and especially with the end goal, never fighting on issues, today's issues, fighting hard and joining together, but the mission of people like me, and perhaps many of you, or maybe most of you, joining with anyone to fight for defense of rights of people, but not forgetting a basic goal, that these questions of ecology and of fascism and of war can never be solved completely until we get rid of that whole bunch of billionaires and millionaires who've been getting stronger and stronger and stronger and taking over the whole damn world, even our minds with Facebook and Twitter and Amazon. To get rid of them completely, to have working only, the profits only going to the people who are doing the work. This is something which the GDR achieved, despite all its blunders and its mistakes and its problems. It achieved that there were no billionaires, and people got something for the work they did. This is a goal I think we should not forget, and with that I'll close. Thank you. Let's ask whoever has questions. Huh?
Well, we have a process.
Yes. Okay.
Which we'll explain in a minute, but first, please reach in your wallets or your purses, and if you have any money, please give it to us. Or pass it around.
If you don't, give it to us anyway.
Victor, what was the name
Will you
of
hold
the
it
fellow
off, Norma,
from
please?
Wait.
Please, Norma. Wait. We have a process.
I can't hear you.
If you have money, we need it, but we are in the black, so it's not an emergency. I don't know why accountants use the color of international anarchism to say we're in a good financial position, but they do it. So again, I want to make two announcements about upcoming events. Next week, we have